60 Scoop has been the catalyst for many of the issues Indigenous families face. For the 60 Scoop and other acts such as the Millennial Scoop to be labeled as services for Indigenous families is wrong. Labeling it as such would be undermining the extreme effects these historically significant events have had on Indigenous children and the families that they later went on to have. An example of these issues and how they're still pressing towards Indigenous communities today is the concerningly recent eradication of the birth alert system in British Columbia. I would like to discuss three strikingly horrible aspects of family services that the government had imposed on Indigenous families in Canada. The 60 Scoop, a period of time dating between the late 1950s and 1980s, where certain areas where the residential school system was implemented was to be replaced by the government's next attempt at destroying Indigenous culture. The 60 Scoop. What was the government's course of action? Implementing a foster care system for Indigenous children to be adopted by non-Indigenous families. This system opted for the adoption of Indigenous children in an attempt to drive them away from their heritage and assimilate them into the norm of Western culture. A lot was done to solidify the suppression of Indigenous culture. A lot of the children were not even aware of their actual Indigenous heritage. The goal was to fully eradicate any aspect of their life living in Indigenous households. But this led to a series of problems for the children within their new homes. They felt isolated, alienated, and ostracized from the rest of their family, as the difference of treatment towards the Indigenous children and any of the children that those foster parents already had were painstakingly clear. Birth alerts is a system in which, based on the circumstances of a pregnant woman, in this case their Indigenous background, the welfare agency that child is administered with will notify the hospital of the woman's impending birth. Then the child is apprehended and placed in special care or foster homes. Unfortunately, this was issued towards Indigenous mothers very frequently, and only very recently have the affected areas started to realize its problems. Most of the time, though, the parents don't even know that a birth alert has been placed upon them. Did you know that the rate of Indigenous children in foster care systems in Quebec is 8 times that of non-Indigenous children? And in British Columbia, birth alerts hadn't even been removed until 2019, leading us to question just how many Indigenous mothers have been impacted by this horrible system in the past decade. It's incredibly sad that a system like this was ever introduced in the first place, and that it took so long for Canada to recognize the problems that arose because of it. Racial profiling towards Indigenous people has led to their very clear overrepresentation in the child welfare system. There are many cases of child abuse that stem from the 60 Scoop and in Indigenous households in which the parents have been subjected to abuse in their youth. This policy was intended to assimilate Indigenous children into white Canadian society. However, the result was a loss of cultural identity and connection for these children and their families. Many of these children were subjected to abuse and reject in their foster homes and suffered long-term emotional and psychological damage as a result. The 60 Scoop also had a devastating impact on Indigenous families who lost their children at such a young age.